Today I'm going to be presenting a PowerPoint on World War I. I suggest taking notes because there's a lot in it. Not sure if we're going to get a test on this, but it's really cool information either way. Alright, so this acronym, MANIA, here, is to help us remember the underlying and immediate causes of World War I. So the M stands for militarism, and militarism is, let me get my notes really quick. Militarism is the emphasis on the importance of military power. So this was very prominent in World War I. A lot of people wanted militarism and a lot of people didn't. A stands for alliance. We'll learn more about alliances, but to give you a basic definition, an alliance is an agreement with a country and another, between a country and another country to help each other out. N stands for nationalism. We all know what nationalism is, but to remind you, nationalism is pride and deep love in one's country. This created a lot of issues in World War I stands for imperialism. Imperialism is building up empires and markets. Everyone wanted the biggest empire and the biggest market during this war because the more market, the more money. And A stands for assassination. That's kind of a little add-on to help you remember that the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand was what sparked the war. So when he was assassinated, this sparked a series of events that basically triggered the war. But his assassination was the main trigger, and within a couple of months, war had begun to spark. To give you more info on alliances during this time were split into two main alliance groups. So on the map you can see the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, but quickly, the Triple Alliance is an alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And the Triple Entente is an alliance between Great Britain, France, and Russia. There are a couple of Slavic allies to Russia, but they were not a part of any other alliance group. They were just kind of their own little alliance group, but these alliances helped each other out during this war and created a lot of interesting tension as well as interesting flow for the war. And these alliances began in 1914. Well, they became stronger in 1914, which is when this whole thing was sparked up. To begin in the U.S. foreign policy, we have the Declaration of Neutrality. Not exactly sure why that image is over there, but okay. So neutrality in America started when President Woodrow Wilson declared America as a neutral country in 1914. So he did this in an effort to protect America in the war, and he definitely did not realize how difficult it would be. But by doing this, he gained the support of many Americans because making America a neutral country was not the first time it had ever happened. This is something that Washington and Jefferson also did. So a lot of Americans supported that in the sense that it was part of history. And immigrants, which made up 30% of America at this time, also supported the neutrality because they were in America to get out of fighting areas. They wanted this neutrality. And in the image here you can see that is Woodrow Wilson, and there is an advertisement for the proclamation of the neutrality of the U.S. This is super important, but it also caused a lot of issues. Becoming a neutral country basically made America a giant target for Germany and other countries. But to start off with the testing of neutrality, we have to address the blockade placed by Great Britain against Germany. In the bottom left image, you can see the red areas are where the blockade was. The blockade consisted of a series of mines that would seize ships. And because of this, other ships, including U.S. ships or British ships, were sunk. So the sinking of the Lusitania sparked a lot of issues. So the sinking of the Lusitania, about 105 or about 1,500 people died, but 128 of those people were Americans, and Wilson was not happy about that. And this boat was sunk because of German torpedoes. German torpedoes hit the boat and sunk it. And I know it says in the article that there was around 1,200 dead, but I've read several other places that there were actually around 1,500 dead. But it was torpedoed, and it sunk, and this is basically what sparked a hate for Germany. Wilson sent Germany a warning that they would be held to extreme accountability for not bombing the ships of the U.S. and other allied countries to the U.S. because the U.S. was a neutral country, and they believed that they had a fair right to free seas. And Germany didn't really like this, so they sank 2 more ships. And Wilson eventually threatened to cut off all diplomatic ties with Germany, and they stopped because they did not want that to happen. Going on to economic ties, Great Britain and France were super strong in this time. They were, helping each other out, making lots of money, blah, blah, blah. And when the U.S. saw this, they wanted a part of it. In 1914, the U.S. suffered a business recession, which made it harder for them to get supplies for the upcoming war. So they kind of hopped on with Great Britain and France and became this whole thing. And they all supported each other. In terms of Germany, the British blockade prevented America from being able to ship anything to Germany. So we didn't make any money off of shipping things to Germany, which resulted in loans. So loans, eventually Woodrow Wilson allowed any U.S. banker to offer $3 billion to either Great Britain or France if they needed it. Say they needed it for supplies or land or whatever. These loans were given, and what they did was they boosted basically what was known about America. They boosted the heroism of America and made them more of a desirable country. With all this, of course, there was a public opinion, because when is there not? In terms of ethnic influence, we have all the immigrants who were happy about this neutrality. They supported what Woodrow Wilson was going to do, and basically, if Woodrow Wilson hated Germany, everyone else would hate Germany. And this was also influenced by British war propaganda. You can see in the bottom right that this is a propaganda poster for Britain, and Britain basically wanted everyone to hate Germany because they hated Germany. So these posters and articles and telegrams and all that stuff was sent to the U.S. to get them on their side. So at this point, everyone hates Germany. Okay, so of course with anything, especially a war, there's going to be a debate. One of these biggest debates that surrounded World War I was how prepared the nation was to fight in the World War. And turns out we were not prepared. The U.S. was not prepared to fight in this war. We did not have a sufficient army. But eventually, Teddy Roosevelt pointed this out to Wilson, and he was like, bro, we're not ready for this war. And he was like, no, Teddy, we're ready for this war. And then after doing some more research, Wilson was like, oh, dang, you're right. We're not ready for this war. So he started urging Congress to expand the Army and the National Guard, which happened, and lots of equipment was constructed. Around 50 warships were constructed within this time, and lots of new equipment, which we'll talk more about later. And of course, there was opposition to the war. There were people who just wanted a bunch of peace. Those 3 parties were populists, progressives, and socialists. We're learning about those kind of right now as I'm making this, so I'm not going to go too much into detail about them, but what you need to know is that those 3 parties were opposed to the war. And they didn't want this war to be fought. They didn't want America to be involved. Several attempts at peace were made, but the biggest was the peace without victory. So the Peace Without Victory speech was a speech given by Wilson in 1917, basically just bolstering the country like, dude, we can do this. You know, look at us. I've prepared us. We can make peace, and we can do this. So yeah. The next couple of things here are, I have 3 images of things that were also heavily debated about in the war, and also heavily, very heavily conflicted. One of them, the first and most, interesting one is probably the Zimmermann telegram. So the Zimmermann telegram was a secret telegram that was sent from the German Foreign Office in January of 1917. The telegram that was sent, which is pictured there, proposed that Germany and Mexico would be allied, and if the U.S. lost in this war, Mexico would be given back Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. This made Wilson so mad. He got super mad about this and banned this kind of telegram communication, because the last thing America needed, especially after just rebuilding themselves, is losing a ton of territory. So yeah, that ended up being a big issue. It was decoded by British intelligence and immediately reported to the U.S., which an immediate stop was put to, so Mexico did not receive that land back. The next thing is the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution was basically one big statement that war had to be fought with purpose, and that they didn't like the fact that Britain and France were allied with Russia. So eventually, and very suddenly, we went in and overthrew the Tsar of Russia at the time, and it kind of just was like a crazy revolution because we didn't like Russia and we wanted to have purpose in the war. And like we saw earlier, there were several submarine attacks that continued to happen in 1917, even though the Germans who were like, hey, we're peaceful now, we don't want you to break off ties with us, but they were still mean. So yeah, those are also 3 important events that you'll definitely want to remember. The war was officially declared on April 2nd of 1917. Wilson was like, all right, we're declaring a war. Boom. And he just stood up and declared the war. So let's get into what the war looked like. So to start, of course, we have to get things moving. Especially in industry and labor. So there were several industries. 4 of them that I'm going to focus on are war industries, food administration, fuel administration, and railroad administration. So war industry was facilitated by Bernard Baruch, and war industry was all about let's get equipment made, let's get these shipped out to the troops. So you can see in the poster to the far right, people said that they were like, we need your silver for bullets. So they often had this type of poster. They also collected tin and several other metals to make stuff for the war. This included ships, guns, gases, everything. Food administration was overseen by Herbert Hoover, and Herbert Hoover basically was like, yo, we need to eat less meat and bread because we need to send it to British and French troops. In doing this, shipment to British and French troops tripled. And Americans stopped buying things like meat and bread and milk and dairy products, fats, sugar, wheat, all that, because it needed to be sent to the French and British troops. This was super important because they needed to be fed. They were the ones fighting for us. So, of course, we had to work together and feed them. Fuel administration was overseen by Harry Garfield, and this included things like coal, and other sources of electricity, gas, all that stuff. And he was like, yo, we gotta save some stuff, man. We gotta, we need to save up this coal because we need it for the war. So non-essential factories and things that consumed gases and fuels were closed. And also these posters, the farthest to the left poster shows that saving light saves coal. So people were urged to only use their lighting in their house when they needed it very much. So a lot of people used candles during this time and lit fires. And finally, we have the Railroad Administration, which was overseen by William McAdoo. McAdoo, I don't know how to say that. And the Railroad Administration was upgraded to more standardized equipment so that these things could be shipped and transported to the French and British troops. So this is kind of the connecting piece of it all. It kind of just pulled it all together, which was really nice. And of course, with anything comes a public opinion. Propaganda was a huge thing in World War I. Political cartoons, propaganda, all that stuff was very popular during this time. So the Creel Committee is run by journalist George Creel, and he basically took charge of all of the propaganda and basically made sure it was more directed towards hating the Germans. So as you can see in most of these posters, you can see something about hating Germans, because that's what everybody needed to believe these days. And the American Protective League came up with this little slogan of "Hate the Hun," which means it kind of stands for the removal of all German products. This includes imports, exports, everything. Anything German is gone. This also made it so that workers and employers could refuse to employ anyone related to anything German. So this definitely put people out of work and got a lot of people fired, which is really sad. And then we have the Espionage and Sedation Acts. So these are socialists, pacifists, and anyone who didn't like the war, basically being told that they are not allowed to speak poorly about the war. And this, speaking about the war poorly, if you're caught, could lead to imprisonment of up to 20 years for those who were not loyal to what the country was doing. This definitely made it very difficult. And one of these dudes was Schneck. Holmes Schneck, I believe, was his name. I can't remember. I think we'll just call him Schneck for now. But Schneck, Holmes handed out anti-draft things, and he was put in prison, but he stood up for his freedom of speech, or whatever, and was like, yo, we have some clear and present danger we need to talk about, and still, he got put in prison for that. So yeah, anyone who opposed to the war was punished. Anyone who did not believe that the country was doing the right thing was punished, and this put a lot of people in jail. Okay, so after deciding that we needed to buff up our armed forces, America got on it. So the Selective Service Act of 1917 was it just boom happened right away after war was declared. So men aged 21 to 30 were drafted to war, and 2.8 million in total were drafted to war. 2.8 were actually inducted, but 9.5 million registered. 2 million of those were volunteers. Eventually, men aged 18 to 45 were drafted because we needed more. A lot of people didn't even make it that far because of disease. Lots of people didn't even see combat because there was so much disease, and they died before. African Americans eventually became involved in this, and around 400,000 African Americans served in World War I. They were very segregated against, and there were lots of racist issues going on. So few of them actually saw combat because anyone fighting in the war did not want to see African Americans as equal to them, so they were never really promoted. I know we've covered a little bit of this, so it's kind of the same thing as the Civil War. People didn't want to view African Americans as equal, so no promotion for you, which is really sad. So there were a lot of effects of World War I on America, both good and bad, but let's focus on the good right now. Well, mostly the good, but more jobs for women opened up. So as men were drafted to the war, people needed to fill their spaces. So women were employed for this, making it really great for women. Some of them volunteered, and some of them even earned wages. And this also urged on the 19th Amendment to Wilson. But I think this is really cool because this is kind of the first time we're really seeing women needed. Like, they're like, yes, we need these women right now. And that's great. But trust me, it didn't last long. So Mexican and African Americans also had available work. They were mostly hired in agriculture and mining in the Southwest, and because that's kind of what they were used to, rather than like factory jobs. So they went to work with what they were used to. But they went to both the North and the South, not just the Southwest, but most of them ended up in the Southwest. So as these people came in, nativism became a huge thing. So nativism, even though it is already a huge thing, we go back to that point of superiority amongst races and religions, and that's starting to happen as Mexicans and African Americans are being hired, as well as immigrants and women. So it's all nativism around superiority of a specific group of people. So in fighting the war, like I said, I'm going to talk about technological advances. This is probably my favorite part because I think this is super interesting. So this is the first time America is seeing machine guns, toxic gases, tanks, airplanes, all this cool stuff being brought in, to war. And I think it's super cool because this helped us a lot. As you can see in the bottom left picture, these men are also wearing gas masks. Gas masks started being produced since that gases were being used on enemy sides. And yeah, this really helped us in the war. We're starting to see like very advanced technology, which continues to advance as we progress in history. There were also naval advances, the most important being the convoy system. So the convoy system was formed, as you can see to the far right, to break the blockade that Britain had put. So this was kind of like a whole system to break the blockade and be able to continue on a path to war. And the not so great part, we have the casualties. So the Spanish influenza knocked out a ton of people. So in combat, we lost 49,000 Americans, but in total, we lost 432,000 Americans. So most of them died from the Spanish flu, which is really sad because a lot of them just died immediately. They didn't really get to see war, like I said before in the previous slide, that a lot of these people never actually got to see the war because they died of disease, which was the Spanish influenza. Okay, so in making peace, we have... So once this war is starting to bubble over a little bit, Wilson comes up with this. He comes up with Wilson's 14 points. But here we have 7 main ones. The 7 main ones are recognition of freedom of the seas, an end to the practice of making secret treaties, referring to the Zimmerman telegram, reduction of national armaments, an impartial adjustment of all colonial claims, self-determination for the various nationalities, removal of trade barriers, specifically the blockade put on by Britain, and 7, a general association of nations. So the last point was his favorite. He definitely drove this one home. And these points eventually led us to become to form the League of Nations, which is kind of like a peace league. So these points were these are the conditions, we'll be peaceful, boom, here you go. And he definitely drove them home. The Treaty of Versailles, we see this here, too, in the Big Four. So the Big Four are David L. Georges Clemenceau, Vittorio Orlando, and Woodrow Wilson. So these guys were all leaders of countries, and they were all like, yeah, we got this, we're gonna do some cool stuff and make peace. So they came up with these peace terms. Germany would be stripped of their arms and colonies. Colonies once owned by Germany and its allies would be taken over by the Allies, which are the Big Four. Signers of the treaty would join a peacekeeping organization. So, also, Wilson stood up and defended his 14 points. He was the very first person to travel abroad for a diplomatic conversation. So, he was the first one. And that was definitely a step in the right direction. And there were a lot of reps for the Allied side. But very few Republicans came to support the other side. So these peace terms eventually went in favor of the Big Four. Okay, so the next thing is ratification, which was kind of the battle after World War I, beginning with partisanship. This is kind of a huge thing between Wilson and the vote that is going to happen in 1918, the election. Wilson originally were like, okay, everyone, vote for Democrats, let's go, let's win this. And Republicans ended up winning the majority of the House. And then Wilson was like, okay, let's just I'm going to support the Republicans, and blah, blah, blah. Because of Senator Lodge, who was a major Republican. And with this kind of crazy head-to-head opposing views, the irreconciliables and reservationists were established. They formed 2 groups, and they opposed views on this election. And of course, there was rejection of the treaty. So Germany refused to join the League of Nations, as well as a lot of people defeating the treaty. So a lot of the treaty rules were not followed, which was very unfortunate. And finally, after the war, there's a lot of downfalls. Like I said previously, there was a high, and now there's going to be a low. So demobilization occurred. This is kind of the biggest thing. So remember when I talked about how women were now being employed because men were being drafted? That all basically failed when men came out of the war and were put back into jobs that were once taken by women. So women no longer have jobs. And because of the war ending, there was a major decrease in the amount of orders and shipments that needed to be made because of the war. Now that it had ended, there was less of that, so there was now less money. And there was also the falling of farm prices because we really didn't farming was starting to become less of a thing, and they weren't as valuable anymore because of that. And finally, the last few things of downfall here that I'm going to finish up on are these three things: the Red Scare, labor conflicts, and race riots. So the Red Scare is basically a huge fear of communism that hit after the war. And everyone just feared that the communists would take over America because they were mad at us or whatever. So there was this huge thing going on, and it led to the development of xenophobia, and eventually immigration restrictions were put on because of this fear of people immigrating to come and take over. So it was kind of like crazy, you know? Like, it was just a crazy scare. And then, of course, we have the labor conflicts. So after the war, people started going back into jobs, and people started to not trust the owners because of the square deals that Roosevelt was offering. They started to not trust their business owners because they were afraid that they were going to be basically scammed into working for free. So a ton of strikes happened in 1919, the first one being in February in Seattle. So these huge strikes occurred, and everything just kind of blew up around that. And as African Americans continued to come into America, race riots started to happen. Because they were able to be hired, there was huge competition for jobs after the war, especially because, you know, white people were back and African Americans were being booted out of their jobs because, you know, white was felt that they were more superior, and everything like that. So that's what I'm going to finish up on. Thanks for bearing with me through this. Bye, period 1.